It had been a few years since the war in Syria broke out, and like any person probably living outside of it, there was like this feeling of hopelessness that was like just constantly controlling everything that I was doing. I just felt like me being here, like it's impossible, that there's no way that I can directly help them besides just sending money. You know what I mean? Like I want to give my hands, I want to give my voice, I want to give something. I woke up from this horrible dream, and it had occurred to me that I don't know why I'm not at least in one of the countries that are hosting the refugees, like Greece. While I didn't have necessarily a medical background, I did want to go there just to give anything that I had. And so I went basically to offer my translation services, assuming that most of the refugees that were coming in would be from Syria. And obviously working under the hands of the doctors and the nurses over there. So I went to Lesbos, I booked my flight.
A lot of people think that the conflict in Syria began in March of 2011. This is when many Syrians began to protest in the aftermath of the Arab uprisings in Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, and Yemen. However, the background to this is that Syrians have been struggling for democracy and human rights in their country for many decades. Beginning in 1970, a brutal dictatorship took over in Syria, run by the late Hafez al-Assad, the father of the current president Bashar al-Assad. Under the Assad family since 1970, Syria has been ruled essentially by a mafia that has squashed oppression, imprisoned thousands, if not tens and hundreds of thousands of people for political reasons, and oppressed in all manner the population. The actual current uprisings that began in March 15th, 2011 were the result of the imprisonment and torture of adolescents who wrote some anti-government graffiti on the walls of a border town called Daraa. In response to this, the government tortured these kids. People came out and protested it peacefully. The government responded with force. And this began a cascade of violence on the part of the government against peaceful demonstrators who were demonstrating for dignity, for hope, for their futures. Over time, the violent repression of peaceful demonstrators ended up promoting a violent and armed response. And we have the evolution of the Syrian uprising, rebellion, into a massive multinational global disaster. So our foreign policy has been to both ignore the conflict and then to exacerbate it. How do they exacerbate it? Well, one, many of the actors in Syria are not Syrians themselves. They are foreign fighters supported by funds from Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Kuwait. Those last three are strong allies of the United States. In fact, they use American-made weaponry in order to enact violence on the Syrian people. And the United States has not put controls on these three countries. Other actors include, of course, Hezbollah, the Shia militia in Lebanon that is supported by Iran, which is also an actor. And then, of course, Turkey, the neighbor of Syria to the north, some forces from Iraq, and then, of course, Russia, which is, has a military occupation in the northwest of Syria and has done a lot of bombing across the country. Today, the conflict has devolved because of a lack of American leadership. I should also mention Israel's a part of this conflict as well, even though it has shown great restraint and not attacking across its border into Syria, but in defending itself. But it's certainly a player not only in that conflict, but in the regional situation as a whole. What has happened is that Syria has turned from a rebellion into a proxy war for these larger powers. Saudi Arabia against Iran, the United States against Russia, Turkey against all the rest of them in order to secure its own rights, especially to a secure border. And now we have the government fighting against over 1,500 different militias, including Sunni militias, Shia militias, Kurdish militias, even some small Christian militias. So it's a real disaster. And I think with American leadership and what used to be called diplomacy or arm twisting and deal making with the larger powers, including China, for example, and others on the UN Security Council, we could have potentially created a diplomatic or political solution early on and avoided this humanitarian disaster.
Most of the boats that we were receiving were primarily from Afghanistan, Iran, Pakistan, Iraq, and I was surprised to see that there were very few from Syria. So this was, I learned, because of the fact that most of the Syrians had already left, but also because the crisis had come to the point where it was becoming easy to manipulate. So at that point, you don't think about it beforehand, but it makes sense. There are open borders, right? We're talking about open borders. That means people are going to be spilling, trying to take advantage of the situation to not just necessarily escape war in Syria, but people from other countries were using it, were taking advantage of the open border situation to escape, like, for example, economic crisis or poverty. The process of even arriving onto Lesbos is such a terrifying one. So what happens is that from Izmir, Turkey, they basically choose somebody from that group of refugees to navigate the raft. The deal is kind of like you navigate the raft for 50% off the price. That's how the process works. So hence the stories of drowning and people sinking and people arriving onto the shores drenched in water because you have an inexperienced driver navigating the raft.
Refugees and
100,000 Syrians.
Syrian refugees in this case.
Tens of thousands of Syrian refugees.
Backlash against refugees.
Let's be blunt. Americans are not well informed about America. So how can we expect that they will be well informed about Syria, which is several thousand miles away? This is a much deeper and broader question than we can talk about in just a few minutes here, but it has a lot to do not only with the media and the superficial coverage of local, national, and international events, or global events, but also with our general consumer culture and the sort of, I don't say sort of, it's the actual dumbing down of America and anti-intellectualism, which has strong roots in American culture for many decades, but has really come to a fore in the current presidency. And it doesn't bode well for our foreign policy when not only the president, but his advisors and much of the population not only doesn't know much about Syria, but doesn't care about Syria or that part of the world. What we can do as citizens is inform ourselves. And there are sources out there. There are credible news sources, not only in the mainstream media, like the New York Times or the BBC, or for people who read other languages. Many of the international agencies produce good reporting on Syria, but there are excellent books and articles that are written about them in accessible language, for example, in the New Yorker and elsewhere. So it's really incumbent on Americans who really want to know how the world works to both combat ignorance at home and to reach out for deeper analyses of what's going on overseas.
I have the majority of my mother's side of the family still residing in Aleppo, Syria, because of financial reasons and just, I guess, a fear. They haven't left Aleppo yet compared to my father's side of the family, and the majority of that side has left and fled either to Lebanon or to Turkey. In order to pick up and leave, it's much more difficult than it sounds, not just for safety reasons, but like I said, if you're not financially stable, you can't just leave everything that you have and then just go look for shelter in a different country. So they've stayed in Aleppo, and the situation there right now, it's not stable at all. There are days when things are kind of quiet, and then there's other days where the airstrikes are just nonstop. So it's definitely very unstable. In terms of communication, Just actually recently, we've been able to communicate with our family in Syria through WhatsApp and Viber. And that's because things have kind of gotten a little bit more calm in the sense that electricity comes a little bit more often than it used to be. So for those who can afford to have internet or can afford to even have a phone, they're able to communicate through WhatsApp and Viber. My mom, for example, she's not addicted to her phone, but you have that anxiety that you always want to have your phone next to you because, oh, if my sister calls me, I want to make sure I can respond to her. Oh, if something happens, I want to make sure that I'm able to know what's happening.
الو اختي والقرآن طلعت روحي ليه ما بتردوا مشغول بالي شو قصة هيدا الانفجار كيفك
قلقانة عنا قلقانة وتعبانين كتير
خير شو في
عن جد اقسم بالله يعني وانا يعني رب العالمين بتشهد علي يوم القيامة يعني ناهيك عن موضوع الكهرباء الماء المعيشة الاكل نار وربي شاهد على كل حرف بحكي لا اكل لا شرب لا كهرباء لا مي لا امان نفسية تعبانة اكتئاب مرض شو بدك يعني حتى وصلت ما وصلنا للدواء ما كذب بس دائما نحن مهددين مشنططين بحالة نفسية لأنه بنعبي يعني عايشين بوهم لا يوصف يعني البطاطا الكيلو 350 طيب انا شو بدي اجيب لعله اللحمه ب 5000
حسبي الله ونعم الوكيل
معاش الموظف 20000 شو بدي اعمل
So life has affected specifically the children of Aleppo in many ways. One of the most significant ways is definitely education. So for those who were a year away from graduating or who were just about to transition into high school, everything has kind of been frozen. So for example, for my cousins who have fled Syria and are now living in Turkey, they have a refugee status, obviously. They're not Turkish citizens. So even being admitted into a school has been a mission.
One of the problems that the refugees might be experiencing is when they're coming over here. One, how long have they been out of school? Depending on what age they were and when the conflict started and when their parents decided to go, it could a year or 2 months could have passed by before they were in school. So where do you actually place them? And when you compact that with their ability to know English, it has to affect their mental stability. If human beings are a culmination of their experiences, there's absolutely no way that being a refugee coming from a war-torn country that it's not going to affect your mental stability. Things you're going to expect in seeing kids like this is kids as they grow to adults is post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, anxiety, oppositional defiant disorder with children, and turning into conduct disorder as they get older.
My uncle was a businessman in Aleppo until he decided to take his family and leave to Mersin, Turkey, which is where a lot of Syrians have fled to because it's the closest area in Turkey to Syria's border. And making that decision was really hard for him because he knew that him leaving means that he would have to, leave his business, leave that, safety net, that life that he's built for him and his family, and pick up and basically go to a country that he doesn't speak the language, he doesn't know anything about it, he doesn't know how he's going to work, if he's going to find a job. Once he arrived to Mersin, he kind of was overtook with this depression, with this grief of, I'm towards the end of my life and suddenly I'm stripped of my job, my home, my family. How can I provide for them? I have this much savings, but that can only last me for so long. So he got depressed and he was complaining of stomach problems, and we discovered that he had colon cancer. So, when you look at a situation like that, he himself, he's passed now, but he himself used to say that, I got sick because I'm so depressed.
You might not be able to do the same career you were doing before, which might have been a sense of pride or of a lot of people define themselves by like what is the job they do. what they do as their life. Like when you introduce people to yourselves, like I'm John and I'm a police officer, and you are expected to know certain things about them. Now that same person could be working at a supermarket, and that's like a difficult thing, which can lead to a lot of other issues dealing with like their family and their sense of self-worth.
But the reality of what's going on in Syria is that it doesn't get quiet. There might be days where, you know, there aren't as many airstrikes. You'll hear sometimes that, oh, you know, somebody just got married and they had this big wedding in the town over, for example, and you kind of see it like, really, people are getting married, like there's a wedding going on, but people are, you know, they have to live at the end of the day. So there's that, you know, side of their lives, and then there's the other side where it's like, okay, we haven't been able to leave our house for the past week because it's just too risky.
But we have lost family. So for example, my cousin, a very, very young man, around 16, 17 years old. His name was Ramadan, and he was one of those he was one of those, like, his personality was so ferocious, he couldn't be stopped. So just another day of Ramadan doing what he wanted to do. Yeah, there was an explosion that had happened right outside the door, and he was so intent on leaving the house despite his mother's refusing him to let him leave the house because he had heard that one of his friends or one of his neighbors was actually hurt by the explosion. So he stepped out the door to help pick up the bodies with the other guys they wanted to just get the body off the floor, and then another one had dropped, and it had hit him directly in the head. His death, one of thousands, but just like any other life that's gone, just like any other life that's gone. And it wasn't a dramatic thing, and it ripped his family apart. Like, it really hurt them to the core, and they really had to like hold strong to keep themselves together. But it's just so entirely out of your hands, and you can only do what you could do in a situation like this, which is just accept and you know, and pray for the best, and pray that only the best is to come, and that it was just his time to leave. And maybe that's a religious perspective on things, but it's the only one that gets our families by. Lulu was this little angel that came off of the raft with her mom and dad, and they were from Halab, they were from Aleppo. And so immediately I was determined to keep her by me the whole time until they were taken until they were taken by car to their next destination. And I kind of just stayed with her, I played with her, I kind of selfishly ignored everything else, because in that moment this girl was like just helping me more so than I could ever help her. Kind of make sense of everything that was going on and how calm she was, and still very scared. She was saying to herself, "Ana khaifa," which means I'm scared in Arabic. But I was like, I don't think you know how brave you are. And so she was telling me about like her life in Aleppo and where she thought she was going, and that she was happy to at least be with her mom and dad. So I just gave her my heart and a whole bunch of candy, and a face that I will never forget. Yeah.
That's an excellent question, and what we used to call the $64,000 question. Or today it would be the $64 billion question. That's approximately how much it would take to rebuild the infrastructure of Syria. Tens of billions of dollars. Where is that money going to come from? What's likely going to come once the war or the conflict ends, it's likely to come from some of the same players who are participating in the destruction of Syria, namely Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Kuwait, and then other members of the Gulf Council, including Abu Dhabi and Dubai, which have these multi-trillion-dollar economies. The real problem, of course, is that with over half the population displaced internally or externally, and the numbers are much higher now, over 11 million displaced, over 5 million in countries like Lebanon, Jordan, Egypt, and of course Turkey, which has over 3 million Syrians. Europe has a few 100,000. The US, to its shame, only has just over 10,000, and we could have done a lot more early on for that, for the refugee crisis. Parenthetically, the situation won't be much improved under the current presidency. The real hope, a real challenge for rebuilding Syria is not the infrastructure. That's easily done. You need cement, concrete, glass, steel, and so forth. The real challenge is rebuilding the social infrastructure, the human infrastructure, bringing people back who have a vision for leadership that goes beyond what we see in the headlines, which is sectarianism. And it's not a question of whether a new Syria will arise, but how it will arise and when it will arise. And I can only hope, and this may be naive, but I'm an optimist at heart, that in time, it will take maybe a generation or two, that Syria will get back on the track that it was on in the early independence period, which is a track of democracy, of human rights, of social justice, and at the same time of great and beautiful cultural developments and civilizational progress. This is what Syria was for millennia. It's the heartland of all civilizations, and it is perhaps the future of civilizations if it's allowed to develop the way it can. Initially, I was going to do my field research, my anthropological research in Egypt, and instead I decided to focus on Syria. And where I was going to study initially something having to do with religion, I decided to study music, which is my own personal passion as a performer of a variety of instruments, and as someone who actually came to really love and appreciate the music of Syria. The Syrian people are extremely generous, open-minded, whether they're very religious or if they're very secular. There's just this sort of warmth to it. And there's something as well that's intangible about everyday life there. A certain pace of life that is a lot slower than here in New York. People have time for you. There's that Arab hospitality mixed in. So if you go to somebody's house, there's no such thing as a quick visit. You have to take off your shoes, go in there and have some coffee or tea or some food. And if you only spend half an hour or so, they say, this doesn't count. Like they've got a little ledger, like that doesn't count as a visit. You have to come back for a real visit and you have to eat. In fact, sometimes it's too much food, and we call it guesticide. They just want to kill you with love and generosity. But it's actually very beautiful. There's a real love for language. You find that in not only poetry, but rhetoric. You find it in artwork and calligraphy. And it's just a really amazing culture that if people learned more about it and accepted that it's equally, if not more important or interesting than our own, then we could accept Syrians as equally human. And that's the first step towards a compassionate engagement with what's going on today. So I really encourage people to learn more, to read, to listen, go to restaurants and eat this wonderful food and talk with the waiters there or the owners, the chefs. Many of them are from Syria or from other Arab countries that have experienced a lot of these same sorts of problems, whether it's Egypt or Tunisia or Libya, and get to know some of these people through sharing what is most valued there: food, music, literature, humanity.